We are joined now by Vice President Kamala Harris. Vice President, we thank you so much for joining us tonight. How would you describe tonight's debate for President Biden?
You know, Lindsay, I'd say a slow start, but a good and strong finish. And I think that what's most important is we saw an extraordinary contrast between the former president and the current president on a variety of issues. Let's start with just facts and telling the truth. Clearly, we've known this for a while. The former president is not burdened by the truth and telling factual stories and statements. But I think what's most important is when we look at what Joe Biden has accomplished over the last 3 years, whether it be an historic infrastructure bill, whether it be the creation of 15 million new jobs in America, over 800,000 manufacturing jobs, bringing manufacturing back to the United States, what we have done to cap the cost of insulin for our seniors at $35 a month, allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices against the big pharmaceutical companies to bring the cost of medication down. I think there's a very clear contrast, and the people of America, I think, saw that in Joe Biden they have a president who's going to fight for them, and in Donald Trump a person who's going to fight for himself.
You said that you don't feel that the former president, President Trump, is burdened by the truth. How would you describe his performance tonight?
Well, I'd say that, first of all, I mean, just look, for example, on the issue of what happened January 6th, the insurrection, that he would not disavow that the behaviors and the conduct, the criminal conduct of those insurrectionists, and then skirted around and never directly answered whether he would accept the outcome of the election this upcoming November. Someone who has talked about how he will be a dictator on day one. He admires dictators, the way he talks about the president of Russia, Putin, with great admiration. Donald Trump, someone who has openly talked about how he will weaponize the Department of Justice against his political enemies. We saw him basically disavow the significance of Charlottesville, basically suggesting that it never happened. So just point after point after point that was just absolutely a lie, frankly. I hate using such a strong word, but there was no truth in what he was saying. And when we think about what's at stake in November, it is about a president like Joe Biden, who is going to fight to protect a woman's right to make decisions about her own body, the freedom that an individual should have to make decisions about their own body and not have their government take that decision from them, versus the former president who openly talks about how proud he is that he hand-selected 3 members of the United States Supreme Court to take those freedoms, to undo the protections of Roe v. Wade. They did exactly as he intended, and now in state after state we're seeing laws being passed that punish health care providers, provide prison, in Texas, prison for life. We're seeing state after state passing laws that provide no exception for rape or incest, and those are Trump abortion bans. Those bans would not be in effect were it not for Donald Trump as president intending to select people who did as he intended, who would undo the protections of Roe v. Wade. So I think the contrast for the American people is quite clear, and in November we have the choice. And ultimately, this is about making a decision about what kind of country we want to live in. And do we want a president who cares for and fights for the American people, or do we want to go back to somebody who basically fights for himself and the American people are secondary to his priorities?
Madam Vice President, as you're well aware, one of the biggest insecurities facing the campaign going into tonight was the claim, potentially, that President Biden is too old, that his mental acuity is just not there. Reaction across the board, including from Democrats, is that they were not convinced potentially tonight. What do you say to those voters who watched tonight and weren't sure that he is mentally fit?
Listen, he did not get off to a strong start in that debate, but he had a strong finish. And, you know, there was a slow start, but a strong finish. And the bottom line is this: let us not decide the outcome of who's going to be president of the United States based on a 90-minute debate. Let's measure that decision against the last 3.5 years, where we have seen extraordinary growth in our economy, where we have seen extraordinary growth in terms of what our standing in the world, what we have done to strengthen NATO and strengthen the relationship with our allies. And, you know, to get more directly to your question, Lindsay, I vice president 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I spent a lot of that time with Joe Biden. Whether it is in the Oval Office where he negotiates bipartisan deals in a way that nobody can in this era. I spend time with him in the Situation Room where he is bringing together leaders from our military and intelligence community to ensure America is safe. Where he is when he is on the national stage convening leaders around the world who I have witnessed go up to Joe Biden asking for his counsel and advice. That's the Joe Biden I see every day. And I would urge folks to look at the record and look at the record of accomplishment and then look at what we've got on the other side in Donald Trump, somebody who lies, somebody who has been found by a court of law and a jury of his peers to be guilty of 34 felonies, someone who intended to take the most fundamental freedom from the American people, which is the freedom to make decisions about their own body, and instead he believes in investing that decision in the government. This is the choice for the people in November, and ultimately I think we have to decide what kind of country do we want to live in.
I know you're short on time, and so I want to respect that. Just last question, as effectively as you've been able to pass along and communicate your message tonight for the campaign, do you feel that he was able to do that same job in communicating to the American people?
What I have simply talked about are the accomplishments of Joe Biden and his administration. He has done it quite well.
Okay, Vice President Kamala Harris, we thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.